There's an archetype of player in the NBA that very few teams have, but every team seems to want, and that's the stretch big. Now, you probably noticed that I have an asterisk next to stretch big, and that's because I think when people are talking about this archetype of player, they don't necessarily just mean a center that can shoot threes. They also want this center to be able to protect the rim at a high level. The reality is, there are a lot of centers in the NBA right now that can shoot threes at what I would consider a respectable clip. Centers shooting threes isn't nearly as much of a commodity as it was 10 years ago. Now, what is a commodity is centers that can offer high-level rim protection while shooting threes at a respectable clip. And every now and then it pops up that there's a team that needs to go out and get one of these guys. Like, these kinds of players are just growing on trees. And I want to dive into why that's actually a lot easier said than done. If at any point you find yourself enjoying this video and you want to see more stuff like this, please consider subscribing. It really does help out the channel so much. Now that we got that out of the way, let's dive into it. So what initially spawned my interest in this specific topic was this tweet that you might have seen that was making the rounds on NBA Twitter. Zion is entering his 6th season. Why have the Pelicans not paired him with a stretch 5 that protects the rim? Now, this is an entirely fair question because pairing this kind of player next to Zion would be an absolutely perfect fit. This is the exact type of player to put next to Zion, who's predominantly a driving threat, inside the arc oriented scorer. He's going to demand a lot of defensive attention with that gravity, and being able to spray it out to a stretch 5 is exactly what you want. And that same stretch 5 being able to offer some rim protection can really help cover for some of Zion's defensive deficiencies. But when you start to dig into the players that fit this bill of being able to shoot threes and being able to protect the rim, you realize how small that list actually is. Now let's go ahead and set some ground rules for players that fit the mold of what I'm going to call the stretch and protect big. For the rim protection aspect, I'm going to be using a minimum block rate of 3.5%. You might be asking yourself, Alex, why are you using block rate instead of blocks per game? And I think block rate's going to do a good job of accounting for lower minute guys who may not be on the floor as often to get as many blocks per game as some higher minute guys. Now, there are 51 total players that meet this minimum block rate of 3.5%. Keep that in mind, okay? For the 3-point shooting part, I limited it to centers that attempt a minimum of 4 threes per 75 possessions and make a minimum of 1.4 threes per 75 possessions. I think that 4 3-point attempts per 75 is a decent enough volume to where an opposing defense can see you get the ball on a catch and shoot opportunity and actually think that, oh, okay, there's a chance he could actually shoot this ball. And then for the 1.5 3-pointers made per 75 possessions, I think that means you're making them at a decent enough volume, theoretically, that the defense will consider honoring you and closing out on you on the 3-point line, thus offering spacing implications for your team's offense as a whole. So we've got the 51 total players that met the 3.5% block rate threshold, and then we've got the 21 total players that met the 3-point shooting thresholds. So that's 72 total players. Do you know how many players of those 72 total players met both the 3-point shooting thresholds and the block rate thresholds? 8 total players. Those players are Joel Embiid, Kristaps Porzingis, Myles Turner, Brook Lopez, Chet Holmgren, Victor Wembanyama, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Al Horford. Now, just from this list of these 8 guys, you can look at it and see, okay, it's not actually that easy to get one of these players. Joel Embiid is obviously untouchable. It's not like the Pelicans could go out and trade for him. Same thing goes for Victor Wembanyama, Chet Holmgren, Jaren Jackson Jr. These guys are young and basically untouchable. So we've got Porzingis, Al Horford, Brook Lopez, and Myles Turner as guys who aren't MVP caliber players and also aren't considered super young assets. Now, Porzingis is one that people were talking about as somebody the Pelicans should have gone out and gotten, and I understand that. I think that is one player that you can kind of criticize the Pelicans for maybe not doing everything in their power to go and get. But I do think there is a general underestimation of just how many concerns people had with Kristaps Porzingis' health. And that was a major factor in why it took so long for a team to actually make a move for him. Additionally, based on some reports that came out around the time when Porzingis was traded, it sounds like he wanted to go to the Celtics and was actively angling to make that happen because the trade ended up being an opt-in in trade. So he kind of had a choice on where he went. I don't know if the Pelicans were trying to trade for him, but it's possible that even if they were, it it wouldn't have mattered. Now we look at the Celtics getting Al Horford from the Oklahoma City Thunder a few years ago, and you go, okay, why didn't the Pelicans go for a guy like Al Horford? Something that people have to realize is Al Horford was making $27.5 million when this trade happened. That was not an easy contract to trade for, especially back in the context of the NBA financial landscape from 3 years ago. Boston had the Kemba Walker salary to facilitate that trade, as well as assets that the Thunder wanted. Then we can look at Myles Turner, a guy who's been in trade rumors for basically half a decade up until he recently signed this contract extension with the Pacers. I think the fact that the Pacers ultimately never ended up trading him is a testament to the fact that the Pacers were not going to accept anything other than a Godfather offer for Myles Turner. Because if that wasn't the case, then he probably would have been traded and he wouldn't be in Indiana right now. Also, looking at a guy like Brook Lopez, he missed the entire 2022 season with a back injury as a center over the age of 30. That's a major red flag, and that's not necessarily a player that GMs are going to be picking up a phone and be actively trying to trade for. I will say this about Brook Lopez. Of all of the guys we've talked about, I think he is probably currently the most attainable player that fits this stretch and protect mold. The next thing that we have to talk about is the fact that Zion basically just had the first healthy season of his entire career. From the Pelicans' perspective, when you're trying to figure out how to build around a player, it really helps if that player is on the floor. Now, you can look at what Zion does best and say, okay, based on his strengths and his weaknesses, we probably need three-point shooting around him. And I think that's entirely fair. I think that's a fully valid criticism. It's very clear that this specific archetype of player is what the Pelicans need now, but I think we underestimate a little bit just how much uncertainty there was around Zion Williamson and whether or not he was going to be able to stay on the floor and consistently provide star-level play over the course of an entire season. I am going to play devil's advocate and look at the Jonas Valanciunas trade and say that I think the Pelicans were trying to get one of these stretch bigs when they made that trade. Now, obviously, you look at Jonas Valanciunas in his time in New Orleans, it hasn't really been what I think they probably hoped it would be, but prior to him coming to New Orleans, he did provide a decent amount of rim protection, meeting that 3.5% threshold that we set earlier in the video. And even though his three-point volume wasn't very high, he did hit his threes at a respectable clip, even if he was only attempting around one per game. Maybe when they traded for him, they were thinking, okay, we can get him to increase his three-point volume, and that just hasn't really happened. So this trade looks a lot worse, especially considering some of the other issues with his fit in New Orleans. But the issue here is that the Pelicans have hitched their horse to two predominantly inside the arc scorers that don't shoot a ton of threes and aren't necessarily the best defenders in the world, even though I think the Pelicans were a good defensive team this year. And I know I'm going to get comments saying, oh, Zion looked much improved on defense this year. Brandon Ingram looked good on defense this year. I'm not necessarily saying that that's wrong. There are certainly circumstances where both of those guys can look good defensively, but my point is you have to put a high-level rim protector next to those guys. One, because they're shouldering a significant offensive burden, and two, just simply because rim protection is important and neither of them are elite rim protectors. And that low three-point volume necessitates a stretch big. Like I said earlier, if all you need is a center that can shoot threes, that's a feasible player to get. There are a lot of guys in the league right now that you can go out and find that can shoot threes at a 34% clip from the center position on 4 or more attempts per game. But that's not the case. They don't just need a center that can shoot. They allowed the 4th highest field goal percentage at the rim last year of any team in the NBA. They absolutely need to acquire better rim protection, regardless of some of the awesome defensive personnel that they have surrounding them on the wings. Additionally, they were 8th lowest in three-point attempt frequency last year. They've got 2 stars who basically don't shoot threes. And when you're built like that, you end up backing yourself into a corner where you have to go out and get one of the hardest types of players in the NBA that there is to acquire. The types of guys that qualify as these floor-stretching, rim-protecting big men aren't your average role players. They're either star-caliber players or really promising young core pieces. The asking price for these types of players is almost always going to be ridiculously high, and the teams that actually do manage to get one of these players typically don't let them go. Really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, like I said earlier, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. That is the easiest way to help support the channel and help me continue making videos like this. All that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.